Good afternoon. My name is Eric Wright. I'm the education specialist for the Wisconsin Veterans Museum, and I'd like to thank everybody for coming out today for our book talk with Dr. Teasel, Muir-Harmony. Before we get started, I just want to mention to everyone that if you have any questions for the presenter today, please be sure to post them in the chat feature here on Zoom. I will be taking those questions and submitting them into a PowerPoint presentation so we can all see them at the end of the program. So just remember, any questions, please submit them via chat. And I'd also like to start off by saying thank you to the Wisconsin Veterans Museum Foundation for their continued support in our virtual programming. We've been doing this ever since we've been on COVID lockdown, and we're going to keep doing it well into the 2022-2023 programming season. So please look forward to more of our book talks, our curator conversations, our trivia nights, our movie nights, and all the other fantastic virtual programming that we do. And this is really made possible by our sponsor, Generac Power Systems. So we'd like to thank them as well. So we're going to get started here, and I would just like to say, first of all, welcome, Dr. Teasel Muir-Harmony. Dr. Muir-Harmony is a historian of science and technology and is the curator of the Apollo spacecraft collection at the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. She's also earned her PhD from MIT and has held positions at the American Institute of Physics and the Adler Planetarium and Astronomy Museum. She's here to talk with us today about her latest book, Operation Moonglow, A Political History of Project Apollo. Dr. Muir-Harmony, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you for attending my talk. I'm excited to share some of my work with you. And so I'll just jump right in.
The floor is all yours.
Share my screen. All right. Okay. Hopefully that's, you see a image of the moon. That's where we'll start. And this is one of my favorite images. It is the moon. It should be familiar, but this was taken by the Apollo 11 crew as they returned to Earth after the first lunar landing in 1969. So I think it's a special image. All right, but to start off today, I'm going to tell you a bit about how this project started. So a number of years ago, I was doing some research at the National Archives, and I was looking at the history of an American observatory in Japan in the 1950s, and I was curious about the larger context of US science and technology in Japan at that period. So I requested a few additional boxes that looked promising to me. And in a manila folder in one of those boxes, I found a report that was dated September 4th, 1962. And it described an exhibit at a department store in downtown Tokyo of the Friendship 7 spacecraft. And you can see a photo of a similar exhibit here. This is the spacecraft that John Glenn used to achieve the first American orbital spaceflight. And the report said that over 500,000 people saw this spaceflight in just 4 days. So this number shocked me. And to give you some context, I'm a curator at the Smithsonian, the National Air and Space Museum. This is one of the most popular museums in the world. And on our most visited days with the most visitors in July, we can get a little over 100,000 people, and that's packed. And so 500,000 people in 4 days is just a spectacular number for an exhibit. And so I was curious, I needed to read more of these documents. And there was a description of several hundred police and guides that channeled the crowd up 9 flights of stairs, zigzagged them across the roof of the building, and brought them down 9 flights of stairs to the exhibit. So the scale and interest of the exhibit is really hard to comprehend. And I knew at the time that John Glenn became an important part of American history in 1962, but I wanted to know what was his significance in Japan, what was the significance of his flight in Japan. And I wanted to know if this story hinted at something larger, something more fundamental about the ties of early spaceflight and foreign relations. And so I continued to look into this story, and I soon discovered that this record-breaking exhibit in Japan was no chance event. All right, so I found example after example of similar exhibits. So here you can see people in Pakistan and Cambodia and the Philippines. The exhibit in Japan was part of his international tour that was humorously called the Fourth Orbit. So Glenn had orbited the Earth 3 times in his spacecraft, and this tour of the spacecraft itself, this exhibit tour, would be the third time the craft orbited the world. So it was called the fourth orbit. And this was the first large-scale U.S. space diplomacy program of its kind. In just 3 months, the spacecraft visited 20 cities and was seen by roughly 4 million people, while another 20 million people watched television programs that were broadcast from the exhibit sites. And this is at a time when the world population is roughly half of what it is today. So it was 3.1 billion. And here you can see what the Friendship 7 spacecraft looked like before and after its flight. And seeing this spacecraft as it looks today helps us appreciate what people must have seen in 1962 at these exhibits. So you can see the image on the right of how atmospheric reentry left its mark on the spacecraft, especially if you look at the painted American flag and the words Friendship 7 from sort of the before and the after. This wear and tear can make spaceflight come alive when you see it in person, and it did this for people in 1962. And as I quickly learned, this wildly popular fourth orbit exhibit was just part of a much larger, more extensive US initiative to foster political alignment through demonstrations of scientific and technological preeminence. Spaceflight became one of the major national priorities in the 1960s, and this owes much to the Cold War and spaceflight's role in US foreign relations. And many histories of the Apollo program focus on how we sent humans to the moon, but I'm going to focus on why the moon landing was a truly global event and why this matters. So moving to the decision to send humans to the moon. So during the transition from the Eisenhower administration to the Kennedy administration, the future of spaceflight was really unclear. There were multiple studies that were conducted, and they estimated the cost of sending humans to the moon, as well as other types of programs. Eisenhower felt it was far too expensive. He didn't think human spaceflight should be a major national priority. Kennedy similarly thought sending humans to the moon was too expensive, and he decided to delay any decision about the future of the American space program until the next fall, when he became president. But things changed very, very quickly in the spring of 1961, and there are a few important events that are critical to the Apollo program timeline. And so some of them are listed here. And one of those is the flight of Yuri Gagarin. So this was a Soviet cosmonaut. It was the first human space flight, and it was a major blow to US prestige. And there were reports and newspaper coverage from around the world suggesting that this flight really impressed people and made them think more highly of the Soviet Union. And this was seen as a blow to the United States within the Cold War context. And then about roughly a week later, there was the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba. And this was seen as another blow to US prestige and caused Kennedy great concern. And so he asked Lyndon Johnson, who was his vice president, as well as the head of the Space Council, to find him a space program that promises dramatic results that we can win. And that's the way Kennedy phrased it. And that's really important. Part of the story is that it had to be dramatic, and it had to be a program that the United States could win. Initially, Kennedy was open to other types of programs, programs that weren't related to spaceflight even, something that was impressive, but it became clear to Kennedy that at this moment in time, it had to be an impressive space program. And Johnson came back to him with the recommendation that the United States send humans to the moon, land them there, and bring them safely back to Earth. And then it was decided that this would be proposed with a deadline by the end of the decade. And then the last date listed here is Alan Shepard's flight. So this is the first successful American space flight, and it had happened on May 5th, 1961. It was a very brief suborbital flight, about 15 minutes, but it gave the president and his advisors confidence to go ahead with proposing Project Apollo a few weeks later. And Kennedy proposed Project Apollo at a joint session of Congress on the nation's urgent needs. And this was May 25th, 1961. And if you've heard any of this speech or seen any of it quoted, it's probably the last 5 minutes of the speech. And that's when he proposed Project Apollo. And that's what this speech is known for. But it's a much longer speech. And I think that the larger context of the speech tells us a lot about the larger context of Apollo and why Kennedy proposed it in the first place. So I'll share a few excerpts with you from this 30-minute long speech. So Kennedy starts off by saying that a battle was taking place in the lands of the rising people. So he's referring to Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. And he said a global revolution was underway, and if the United States did not act decisively, the adversaries of freedom would ride the crest of the wave to capture it for themselves. So this warning gives us insight into one of the major reasons a nation would invest in a costly scientific and engineering program. So these political reasons and motivations. In the 1940s, World War II had upended the global order. The United States and the Soviet Union were not only the dominant powers in the world, they were competing powers. In addition, a wave of independent movements led to the disintegration of European empires. So between 1945 and 1970, the number of new nations increased nearly fourfold. In 1960 alone, this is the year that Kennedy was elected president of the United States, 17 African colonies became independent nations. So the United States and the Soviet Union, they stepped in and they competed to guide this global transformation. And each superpower attempted to create a global coalition aligned with their respective ideologies. When the United States sought to foster liberal democracy, and the Soviet Union advocated for communism. So simultaneously, the development of nuclear weapons in the 1940s upended how wars were waged. The US and the Soviet Union staged proxy wars and covertly backed coups, but much of their geopolitical influence came from soft power rather than coercive force. So this idea of winning the hearts and minds of the world, trying to convince people that either democracy or communism was the best political system to pursue. A nuclear stalemate really elevated the significance of propaganda and psychological strategy. And this is the context in which Kennedy proposed Apollo. In this speech, Kennedy asked Congress for additional funds for other things like public diplomacy and other issues related to national security. So it's a much broader sort of picture of the nation's urgent needs. And Apollo comes at the very end. And here's an excerpt from that part of the speech. So after 30 minutes of outlining his extensive plan, Kennedy added one more urgent national need, and that's Project Apollo. And for Kennedy, sending humans to the moon and returning them safely back to Earth within the decade was part of the battle going on around the world between freedom and tyranny. It was not simply about securing American prestige or projecting technological capability. Spaceflight, he said, was impacting the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. And the road he's talking about is liberal democracy versus communism. And so 4 interconnected currents in the 20th century really laid fertile ground for the launch of the space age and America's quest for the moon. And that's the Cold War, decolonization, the rise of mass communication like television, and a vision of science and technology as drivers of progress, national power, and prestige. So when Kennedy proposed Project Apollo, he initiated the most expensive civilian technological program in history. Sending men to the moon cost the United States the equivalent of hundreds of billions of dollars today, more than 18 times what the country spent on the Panama Canal, more than 5 times the expense of the Manhattan Project, and even more than Eisenhower's interstate highway system. So extraordinarily expensive. And before humans landed on the moon, Project Apollo employed a workforce of hundreds of thousands and initiated a warlike mobilization of federal resources. And this slide just gives you a sort of a brief overview of the contours of the Apollo program. So over the program's history, there were 11 crewed missions, 6 lunar landing missions. In total, 12 astronauts walked on the lunar surface, and they collected about 842 pounds of lunar samples. I think it's always important to note that at this point, no human has been more than 400 miles from Earth since 1972, with the last Apollo mission, Apollo 17. And the cost of the program at that time was around $25 billion. Today, it's estimated to be closer to about, for inflation, $280 billion. So Apollo getting humans to the moon required a number of things. It required the development of understanding of things like rendezvous and docking and spacewalking. So the United States needed more expertise in space. And a lot of this was achieved through the Gemini program. This is the second human spaceflight program that the United States pursued. And this was over 10 missions over the course of 2 years, really developed this expertise. And it also required new technology, new hardware. Here you'll see the Saturn V. This is the largest rocket booster ever built by the United States. And this is the rocket that was necessary for sending the Apollo astronauts to the moon. It stood 363 feet high and had a liftoff thrust of 7.5 million pounds. And the Saturn V was a 3-stage rocket. And at the top of it, you can see in the diagram here, sat a spacecraft that was also multiple stages. So this is one of the stages of the spacecraft. This is the command module. And this one here in the picture is the Columbia command module from the Apollo 11 mission, the first lunar landing mission. And this is part of my collection at the Smithsonian, one of my favorite artifacts. This was the home of the astronauts on their way to and from the moon. And it's also the part of the spacecraft that returns to Earth. And it was designed to withstand temperatures up to 5,000 degrees. And it required a very innovative heat shield and an elaborate system of parachutes that slowed it at reentry. Overall, just to give you a sense of the scale, it's 10 feet 7 inches tall by 12 feet 10 inches wide. And here you can see inside the spacecraft. On the bottom are the couches or their seats, basically. And Armstrong, the first person to walk on the moon, he sat on the left for the Apollo 11 mission. Michael Collins, command module pilot, sat on the far right. And then Buzz Aldrin sat in that middle seat. And then you can see that main control panel. And that's all at arm's reach from where the astronauts sat. And it's over 500 switches, indicators, and instruments. And I'll highlight a few for you. So this is the display and keyboard for the Apollo guidance computer. It's also known as a DISCI. This is where the switches for abort, boost, and entry were located. Here are the telecommunication switches and the reaction control system on the left and the environmental controls. Here's another part of the spacecraft. This is the Lunar Module. This particular one is the Lunar Module 2 at the Smithsonian. And 2 of the astronauts would have landed on the lunar surface in this vehicle, while 1 astronaut remained in lunar orbit in the command module. They would have walked around on the lunar surface and then returned to the vehicle. And then that top part of the lunar module, the ascent stage would have brought them back into lunar orbit to join with the command module and then return to Earth. But as I mentioned, so Kennedy's goal of sending humans to the moon was not just sending humans to the moon. It was also about winning hearts and minds of the world and convincing other nations to align with the United States and to pursue liberal democracy. The US had to build up this sort of massive public relations program related to spaceflight, and it was the responsibility of the US Information Agency. This was an agency that was established during the Eisenhower administration in 1953 as an effort to consolidate the US's overseas information efforts. And while NASA was responsible for domestic public relations, the USAA took charge of the information program for foreign audiences. And they designed and produced hundreds of thousands of films and film screenings, exhibits, pamphlets, and books, radio broadcasts, spacecraft tours, and astronauts' appearances, the distribution of space buttons and press packets. And they not only told the story of America's space program abroad, they really actively cultivated a global audience that was interested in and engaged with spaceflight. And they didn't go into this thinking that people were going to be interested in spaceflight. They really thought part of their job was to get them interested in spaceflight and then use that as an opportunity to develop further conversations and connections with this international audience. This included sort of extensive astronaut tours and scientist tours around the world. Here you can see the Gemini 5 crew in Ethiopia, and show you another image. This is from another astronaut tour. This one shows Neil Armstrong in Chile, and Armstrong was known at being particularly talented when it came to public diplomacy and engaging with international audiences. And his biographer, James Hansen, has suggested that it might have been, this characteristic might have been influential in 1969 when he was selected to be the first person on the moon, which really illuminates the importance of diplomacy to spaceflight. And so Armstrong went to the extra effort of learning phrases in local languages and learning about local history to incorporate these elements into his speeches in order to connect with the audiences throughout South America on this trip. So ahead of the first lunar landing, the USIA initiated the largest public relations campaign in world history to take full advantage of the foreign relations potential of the mission. Years of programming and events around the world had taught foreign affairs officers that too much emphasis on the fact that the moon landing was an American accomplishment, images of the US flag or statements about American greatness or power did not come across well with foreign audiences. And so they recognized that it would be politically advantageous to not only foster this global audience, but to encourage a sense of participation in the moon landing. So they did this a number of ways. Through a lot of the similar type of programming I've mentioned, so thousands of radio features, TV programs, and films. They distributed stories and photographs to thousands of newspapers and worked with journalists. They distributed thousands of books and pamphlets, over 30,000 posters, charts, maps, rocket models, spacesuits, space food too, and space souvenirs. So to give you a sense, just a small story, they distributed 100,000 souvenir buttons in the city of Warsaw. And each button depicted a graphic lunar module that was superimposed on a facepiece of an astronaut's helmet with the words Apollo written in bold. And then the buttons came in the colors of the American flag, so red, white, and blue, but they did not include any direct reference to the United States. This was seen as strategically important. And reports said that everyone in Warsaw was basically wearing these buttons. There are also sort of extensive space exhibits that reach millions of people ahead of the mission. To give you a sense of their scale, in Japan alone, nearly 1 million people visited 36 Apollo 11 exhibits scattered around the country. There were also, like this exhibit you can see here, exhibits set up in department stores throughout West Germany. There was a special agreement made with a department store chain. So there were 180 department stores in West Germany showing space exhibits. So the embassies had small exhibits as well. So just exhibits scattered around the world to get people excited for the flight. And in the 1960s, the US built up a global communications infrastructure that not only supported space missions, tracking and keeping the astronauts in touch with mission control, but also enabled a global audience to watch the first lunar landing live on television altogether. The Apollo network was a series of ground stations around the world, and they were used in conjunction with the Intelsat communications satellite system to bring TV coverage of the moon landing to a global audience. By 1969, the number of television sets around the world had grown 20-fold. Between the mid-1950s and 1969, it reached over 150 million sets. So this is just a huge growth. So this was also a moment when access to television was also increasing, and that's an important part of this story as well. But there were many places around the world where there weren't many TVs in homes, and in these places, the United States set up TV sets and exhibits, and also in outdoor squares or sports stadiums. They'd set up screens, and in places where there weren't ground stations, they would actually project documentary films of spaceflight and then play the live radio coverage of the missions. to give you an example of the sort of the coordination between the US government and foreign TV networks to get access to the coverage of the first lunar landing. Here's a story about Venezuela. So there was no satellite ground station in Venezuela to receive the television from the Intelsat satellite network of the first lunar landing. So the United States USIA worked with the US Air Force to transport a ground station to Venezuela, and the US covered the cost of that shipping. And this made Apollo 11 the first international event seen live on 1.5 million TV sets in Venezuela and Colombia. So it was done just in time. In this image, you can see here, this is the astronauts from the mission. They visited Colombia after the mission. So you can see them in the picture. And then here's a stamp from Venezuela. And many countries around the world produce stamps celebrating the mission. This is just one example. And part of the planning for the first lunar landing involved thinking through the sort of the symbolism of the mission. And in the White House, NASA, and at the State Department, officials discussed what types of symbolic gestures should be carried out by the astronauts to the moon to reap the greatest political rewards for the lunar landing. And this was something that President Nixon was involved in. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger played a role, as well as the directors of all these agencies. NASA Administrator Thomas Paine set up a symbolic activities committee, and a month before the mission, NASA decided to invite heads of state to compose messages of goodwill, which the Apollo 11 crew would place on the moon. You can see the Apollo goodwill disc here. So they were etched on this disc in sort of miniature. And there were a number of ideas that were brought up that were not taken up. So one of the ideas was sending an international volume of commemorative poetry to the moon, and that the UN would invite each country to select a poet to compose a new work specifically for the landing, and that would be left on the moon and reflect the diversity of world culture. Another idea was taking soil from each of the continents and spreading it out on the lunar surface. That was also decided that wasn't a good idea. But there were a number of ideas that were taken up. So this gold olive branch was left on the moon. This is a symbol of peace. And they brought up items to acknowledge and represent and honor astronauts and cosmonauts who had perished. So the Apollo 1 mission patch you can see here, that was a mission. There was a horrible accident, and the astronauts perished on the launch pad during a test. And so they wanted to recognize those astronauts. And they also had items from Soviet cosmonauts as well. There was a lot of debate about whether or not the United States should raise a flag on the moon. There was concern that it would suggest territorial possession. And the 1967 UN Outer Space Treaty had really codified that no nation could claim sovereignty over the moon. The State Department worried that raising an American flag on the moon would cause international criticism, and instead suggested that the United States should have just an image of the flag on a plaque, or even the flag on the astronaut suits. That was enough. But members of Congress really rejected this idea. They rejected a proposed idea of putting a UN flag on the moon, sort of to balance out sort of the symbolic impact of the American flag on the moon. And they made the case that US taxpayers had funded Apollo, so an American flag should be raised on the moon. And they threatened NASA funding for the next fiscal year. The same day, NASA announced that they would raise a flag on the moon, and Congress approved NASA appropriations bill. So they included a provision in the appropriations bill that the flag of the US and no other flag should be implanted on the surface of the moon by the missions funded by the United States. So sort of ending the debate. And here you can see, this is a demonstration of the lunar flag assembly. It had to be specially designed because the astronauts' movement inside spacesuits are somewhat restricted. And so it was carefully engineered for that lunar environment. Another part of the symbolism of the Apollo program, so the mission emblem from Apollo 11, these were all designed by the crews of the missions, and this one in particular was primarily designed by Michael Collins. but with feedback from the other astronauts. And they wanted to make sure that they wrote Apollo 11 with the numeral 11 as opposed to the word in English 11, because they wanted it to be inclusive and they wanted people who didn't speak English to be able to read it more easily. They also made the decision to leave their last names off of this emblem. That was somewhat unusual. Usually you have the last name of the astronauts on the patch, and they decided that this should really represent something broader than the three of them. So it should be representative of everyone who worked on the Apollo program and everyone who was taking part in the mission. A sort of a fun little element here. So, you see the eagle carried the olive branch. This is a symbol of peace, but you also see the shadow on the Earth here, and it's incorrect. It should be at the bottom part. If you've ever seen the Earthrise photo, you would recognize that. So this is a little error, but I love it because it's just remained part of the patch. But it gives you a sense of how new the view of the Earth from the moon was at that time, and so it wasn't familiar that this was the wrong angle for the shadow. All right, so moving ahead. So the United States was ready to send humans to the moon in July 1969. Apollo 11 launched at 9:32 a.m. Eastern Time. And it was described by Norman Mailer as a nightmare of sound, so powerful that it could even be heard 100 miles away. And about 800 foreign correspondents covered the mission from Cape Canaveral and Houston in a total of 33 languages. And as the astronauts made their 3-day journey to the moon, television and radio stations around the world contacted local USIA officers and ambassadors and field operators, and then invited them to appear on Apollo-themed television broadcasts and radio broadcasts. So a lot of engagement with foreign affairs officers. To give you a sense, an estimated 80% of Netherlands' total population of 12 million people followed that launch. And supposedly gas stations in Holland were distributing moon maps instead of road maps. And you see stories like that from all over the world. And I could go on and on and on, but I'll just leave you with that one story for now. Here you can see people in Korea watching the launch of Apollo 11. So the astronauts landed on the moon on July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed the Eagle Lunar Module, while Mike Collins orbited around the moon in the command module. And at that moment, people around the world celebrated. So in Rio de Janeiro, church bells started ringing throughout the city. Hundreds of Brazilians gathered at the Museum of Modern Art, and they stood in silence at first. There was a special space center there, and then they cheered successful. In Tokyo, it was just 5:17 a.m. and cheers of, what could be roughly translated as "Long Live Apollo" were heard throughout the city, and millions of more people met in public squares in Seoul and Montreal and countless cities and towns throughout the world to witness the lunar landing live with others. And they were joined by over 500 million people around the world and hundreds of millions more listening on their radios. One thing I always like to point out is that power companies reported a surge in energy consumption because of all the TV sets and living room lights that were left on to follow the flight. About 6 hours after they landed, Armstrong left the spacecraft, but before he descended the ladder of the lunar module, he paused on what's called the porch, and he pulled the lever with his left hand. And this released the equipment bay, which held a TV camera. And this, you can see where it's located right here. And he made sure that everyone back on Earth could watch his first steps on the moon. This was the largest television audience in history. And then he jumped from the last rung to the pad of the lunar module. And with one foot on the pad and one on the surface, he said, "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." And he tested the ground and started taking pictures. He was followed about 20 minutes later by Buzz Aldrin. And so their time in the lunar surface, their moonwalk, lasted about 2.5 hours in total, and their entire time on the moon was a little less than a day. 12 astronauts over the course of 6 missions eventually would collect nearly 850 pounds of rocks, pebbles, core samples, dust, and soil from the lunar surface. and returned in total over 2,000 samples from 6 lunar landing sites. And so some of the later missions, the astronauts stayed on the lunar surface for 3 days and had 3 EVAs. Lunar material and data collected during the Apollo missions have really transformed our understanding of the formation of the moon and our solar system. To give you a little view on that, here's a picture of an astronaut collecting lunar samples. So they wore checklists on their arms that detailed the sample collection schedule for their mission. And they often photographed these samples in place before they scooped them up, and they recorded the material for later scientific analysis. So alongside the sample, they would place this instrument, and it would help calibrate the rock size in color and orientation. They would place it in a sample bag with a unique identification number, and these bags were placed in rock boxes like you can see here. Now with the Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong noticed that the rock box wasn't completely full even after they had collected everything that was on their list. And so he ended up scooping up some soil and just filling in the extra holes in the rock box. This soil, it's called Armstrong's packing soil, but it actually became extraordinarily important and influential, and maybe the most studied geologic sample in history. So it's quite lucky that he just observed that and decided to add a little extra lunar material near the end of that mission. So in addition to collecting samples, which is usually what you'll hear about with the Apollo program, they also conducted experiments. And so Apollo 11 carried the early Apollo scientific experiment package, and all subsequent missions carried more extensive versions of this package. And it included a laser ranging retroreflector, a passive seismic experiment, and a solar wind composition experiment. This is just to give you a close-up of the laser ranging retroreflector experiment. It's about the size of a suitcase. This one here is in the Smithsonian's collection. So it consists of a series of corner cube mirrors designed to reflect incoming light beam back to exactly where it came from. And so scientists measured the amount of time that it would take for light to travel from a laser from Earth to the moon, hit this laser ranging reflector, and be reflected back to Earth. So they recorded that amount of time, and that helped them calculate the distance to the moon in a more precise way than had ever been calculated before. It's also really useful for determining the moon's information about the moon's orbit and the rate at which the moon is receding from the Earth. And so every year, we now know that the moon drifts about an inch away from Earth. So in addition to all these experiments and to collecting lunar samples, there were also symbolic elements to the mission. Like I mentioned before, so one thing they did is they unveiled this plaque, which was mounted behind the ladder of the lunar module, and they read the inscription for the global television audience that was following the flight. And it says, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon, July 1969 AD. We came in peace for all mankind." And the Apollo 11 crew and President Nixon's names were etched below the message. And there's a lot of symbolism here, and I'll just point out one element as it depicts the Earth's 2 hemispheres, and there are no political boundaries depicted on this plaque. And so this is the view of the Earth from the moon, but it's also supposed to symbolize that this is an inclusive mission. This is for all humankind. This isn't just an American mission. This is about something much broader than that. And this had input from the Library of Congress, the Smithsonian, from NASA, and then also Nixon's speechwriters had a big role in composing this message that would be left on the lunar surface. President Nixon called the astronauts from the Oval Office, and he congratulated them and then conveyed a message to the broader global audience tuning into the broadcast that evening. And he said, "Because of what you have done, the heavens have become a part of man's world." And then he went on to say that for one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one. So as this telephone conversation really conveys, this was the first time in history that humans had landed on another celestial body. But it was also very importantly, the first time that they came together to witness an event in larger numbers than ever before. And so it's estimated that about half the world's population was following this mission, just an incredible number of people. And part of the experience of following the first lunar landing was the awareness that you were doing it together with the rest of the world. And so in the television coverage and in the newspaper coverage, you'd see images like this. You'd see images of people around the world following that flight. And it was such an essential part of the Apollo program and that mission that when astronauts Aldrin and Armstrong returned to Earth, they were talking to each other while they were in quarantine. And this was their opportunity to see news coverage of the mission. And Buzz Aldrin turned to Neil Armstrong and he said, it looks like they were having a party on Earth and we missed the whole thing. So it was a bit of a joke, but it also points to the fact that that the lunar landing was an event that happened on the moon, but it was also a historic event on Earth. One of the few people who did not get to watch Armstrong and Aldrin's first steps on the moon was Michael Collins, who's pictured here. So it was his job to stay in the command module orbiting the moon as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin walked on the lunar surface. And as his spacecraft swung behind the moon, he was blocked from all radio communication with his crewmates, as well as the rest of humanity back down on Earth. And a NASA official commented sort of dramatically, sort of joking, he said, "Not since Adam has any human known such solitude as Michael Collins is experiencing." Collins said that he felt this isolation powerfully, but he still joked, if a count were taken, the score would be 3 billion plus 2 over on the other side of the moon and 1 plus God only knows what on this side. But this sense of solitude did not last very long for him. And what impressed Collins most on his return to Earth was not the isolation of space travel, but its unifying effects. So after their mission, the Apollo 11 crew traveled the world and they visited over 20 countries in 2 months. And here you can see them on their first stop in Mexico City. And Collins is there over on the left. And I spoke to Mike Collins some 40 years after the moon landing, and he told me that what he discovered on returning to planet Earth was the opposite of what he experienced orbiting the far side of the moon. And this was a profound sense of community. And he said, I thought that when we went to different countries that people would say, you Americans achieved X, Y, Z, that everywhere the astronauts went, it was we human beings, we did it. That was the punchline everywhere we went. That use of we instead of you Americans or you astronauts attests to the profound sense of collective participation felt by billions of people when humans first set foot on the moon. And he elaborated and he said that the trip around the world kind of changed him. It opened his vista. He said, I would not swap the US for any other place, but I think when we are in the business of foreign policy, the technology that goes into foreign policy, the use of that technology, how it manifests itself and how we treat other countries, I think it's important that we try not to be not the dominant leader. I think we ought to bend over backwards to have a unified worldwide approach. So the Apollo program not only taught us about the formation of the moon and our solar system, it had tangible and immediate impacts on US foreign relations. It created apolitical opportunities, or what we're seeing as apolitical opportunities for US diplomats to meet with local leaders. It was useful in displacing negative newspaper headlines about the US, especially related to the Vietnam War, and to the impacts of the astronauts' giant step tour that I just mentioned. President Nixon even traveled the world after the moon landing to promote his foreign relations agenda, and his diplomatic tour was aptly codenamed Operation Moonglow. So this is where I get the title of my book from. And there's much more to that story. But beyond these immediate impacts and scientific discoveries, Apollo revealed an important lesson about being an effective global leader. So public diplomats in the report after the moon landing, they observed that there was a widespread sense of unity brought about by Apollo 11 programming, and they asked if it signaled an emerging new dimension in the international political process, comparable to the experience of unity that might be expected to emerge from such global disasters as a world epidemic, a meteor collision, or nuclear accident. Commentary around the world, they reported stress that the lunar landing was an achievement for all humankind. And this really surprised them a bit. It took them aback. And this was seen as perhaps the most significant impact of the Apollo program. according to these public diplomats, and it really echoes what Mike Collins observed. They emphasize that there was an expressed sense of solidarity of the human community, a sense apparently heightened by the awareness that the whole of mankind was sharing the emotions and exhalation of a single experience. So to conclude, for Apollo to win hearts and minds, for it to advance U.S. national interests, to achieve the goal that Kennedy set out in 1961, it required not only landing humans on the moon, it also required foregoing the message of national achievement in favor of encouraging global participation and the unity of humankind. So thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to any questions you may have. I'll stop sharing my screen now.
That was a fantastic presentation, Dr. Muir-Harmony. I got many comments while you were talking about just how wonderful it is and how it's great to look at history from a different viewpoint, looking at the political or the aspects of it, as opposed to just the missions themselves. We do have a few questions here. Let me bring up my screen. The first question is, how long had the Soviet Union and the US been working on their space programs before Gagarin's first flight?
That's a great question, and it is actually somewhat difficult to answer because there was a lot of important work that went into rocketry in both countries, and then also early history of rocketry in Germany that fed directly into these space programs. So you could trace that lineage back to the beginning of the 20th century, the 1920s, or if you talk about theory, even earlier. But the sort of, I would say that the United States and the Soviet Union really got going on their space programs, especially related to satellites, in the mid-1950s, and then sort of built out their programs after that. So when it came to human spaceflight, it came a little bit later than the launching of satellites, but actually not that much later. So the first artificial satellite launched in 1957, and then Gagarin's flight was 1961. So it was a pretty rapid timeline.
Yeah, I know that sounds very rapid. Move on to the next question. In your research, did you find any religious implications related to our space program with regard to exporting this excitement of space travel to different cultures?
So there are a lot of sort of intersections of religion and space exploration and the Apollo program. So there are a few different stories that I could tell. And one of them is from Apollo 8, probably maybe the most well-known example. The astronauts, this was the first time people would be traveling to the moon. This was an orbital flight, and it just so happened that it was going to be Christmas Eve, 1968. And so the astronauts were told that, for their live broadcast from lunar orbit, more people would be hearing their voices than had heard any human voice in history say something appropriate. And because it was Christmas Eve, they wanted to do something that sort of to recognize the holiday, but was also as inclusive as possible. And so the commander of that mission, Frank Borman, contacted the USIA science advisor, who contacted a friend, and they decided to read a passage from Genesis. And it was, for the most part, interpreted as very moving. There was some protest in the United States and some critique of the lack of separation of church and state. And so after that, the astronauts had to be a bit more sort of careful. But in general, that was seen as quite a positive thing. But then you get to Apollo 11, and Buzz Aldrin, he wanted to take communion on the moon, and he actually brought up a little chalice and a little bit of wine and a wafer, and he did take communion on the moon, but he was asked not to say anything directly in the broadcast. So you can hear it in the recording, and he basically just asked people to take a moment of time for reflection, and that's when he's taking communion on the moon. So those are some moments of sort of the intersection of religion and spaceflight.
Yeah, I can imagine that's, once you get into that area, it can be pretty difficult.
Yeah, I will say also that the Pope was a fan and ended up meeting with the astronauts on their diplomatic tours, and he was following the mission from the Vatican Observatory.
Did the Apollo network require any concessions on the part of the U.S. to the other countries involved, or was there participation more goodwill, I suppose?
So there was important diplomatic agreements that were made, both so with the Apollo network that I mentioned, but also a lot of the ground tracking stations that were in support of U.S. space exploration more generally. And there was I guess a fair amount of work that went into ensuring that these stations would be interpreted as something positive for the country. So there's all this sort of related public relations campaign within these countries to ensure that people would be excited about the location of these American facilities. So they had exhibit space, they had lectures. The astronauts, when they traveled the world, they would make sure to stop in the countries with these tracking facilities. So Australia, for example, which was really important to the Apollo 11 mission and making sure that it was broadcast around the world, always received a lot of attention from the astronauts, and they would often they stopped twice with the Apollo 11 tour. I think they stopped in both in Perth and Sydney. And so that was one way that there was like an additional attention given to the Apollo network. But it was an important partnership, and it was essential to the success of the American space program.
Did the Russians have any kind of public relations campaign to counter the U.S. efforts?
They did. So they had a very similar type of global public relations campaign promoting their space program. And they also had a sort of a counter propaganda campaign against the US program. And the US did a similar type of thing, sort of downplaying some of the Soviet achievements. But what's sort of interesting in this story is that the Soviet Union initially really emphasized astronaut or cosmonaut diplomatic tours around the world. And in response, the U.S. then emphasized things like the spacecraft tours, like the John Glenn Friendship 7 fourth orbit exhibit. And part of the reason the Soviet Union had the cosmonauts traveling internationally is because they didn't want technical information about their spacecraft out. There was some concern that because of the way that the spacecraft landed, so the cosmonaut had to eject from the spacecraft before it landed and actually crash landed into land. So there was some concern that this wouldn't really count as achieving a successful spaceflight. And so the design of the spacecraft was kept secret. And so instead, they really emphasized, having Gagarin just go out himself and meet with foreign leaders and foreign publics. And so the US then emphasized the technology. Things evolved over time and it shifted, but the US program was much more open when it came to inviting press to the launches and covering information and just providing a ton of open information for people. And this became an important part of the messaging, so that this was seen as representative of the openness of a democratic society. And so that approach to messaging became symbolic of the differences between those two societies as well.
No, that's an excellent point. What was the role played by the belief by U.S. intelligence community that a Russian lunar landing was imminent, and the impetus for its accelerations of the Apollo 8 and Apollo 11 missions?
So it was quite important for the timing of Apollo 8 in particular. There was knowledge in 1968 and earlier than that, but in 1968 in particular, the CIA was tracking this stuff. There was knowledge that the Soviet Union had a lunar exploration program. Soviet Union actually had two. And that was one of the issues and part of the reason that it didn't achieve a lunar landing program. But they had a lunar orbital program and a lunar landing program. And they sent a spacecraft Zond 5, which had issues at reentry, but they sent it on a flyby mission to the moon in 68. And it did have some life on board. So there's animal life, like there were turtles and I think flies, but they had a problem at landing. But the US tracked this, the CIA tracked the landing of this spacecraft. And so there was real concern that the Soviet Union was like neck and neck with the United States. And this was part of the motivation to move up the timeline for Apollo 8. And there's a lot there. I can go into detail. I don't know how much interest there is, but at that point they were pretty neck and neck. I would say there were serious issues with the depressurization of the Soviet spacecraft at reentry, and then also with their launch vehicle. With Apollo 11, the primary concern at that point was the Soviet Union had a lunar probe that was launched around just before Apollo, but it was the expectation that it was getting to the moon around the same time as Apollo. So there was concern that there might be some type of interference. Luckily, the commander from Apollo 8, Frank Borman, actually took a trip to the Soviet Union in early July 1969, and he met people in the Soviet Union from the space program that he was able to contact directly. And so they were able to exchange information and assured the United States that there were going to be no issues of interference with the Soviet lunar probe and the Apollo 11 landing mission. So the Soviet mission ended up crashing. It was unfortunate. That one wasn't a success, but the Soviet Union did have a lot going on in space by the late 1960s, and they had these lunar programs. So there was real competition, although there was no Soviet human landing.
I think this is going to be our last question, if I'm not mistaken. It is. As a young person, what interests or education led you to your occupation in this particular research area and as an author?
Well, I was always interested in the history of astronomy from a very young age. It just captured my attention. And then after college, I got a job at the Smithsonian, and I started learning about the relationship between science, technology, and diplomacy, and spaceflight and diplomacy. And so then that set me off on this, and years of graduate school and just being in the archives and finding this material and finding this story. The Apollo program is so well told. There are so many books on Apollo, but when I found these documents that had not appeared in any other book that I had seen, it was really exciting, and I realized that there were new stories to tell about one of the most familiar stories in history. So as a historian, that is like quite a thrill, and it really led me to this specific topic, and my research continues to look at the important role of or relationship between spaceflight and diplomacy.
Well, it was wonderful having you here today, and like I said, everybody really enjoyed your presentation and the topic as well. And once again, just thank you very much for joining us today, and we greatly appreciate it. Thank you, Dr. Muir-Harmony. Thank
you so much. Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to thank everybody else who came out to attend this presentation today. Please go to wisbetsmuseum.com, our website, to find more information about upcoming programs that we have. I hope everybody has a great rest of their Monday.